everyone, Bill Duvendack here with an astrological course. I hope you enjoy it. Get comfortable. Make sure you've got pen and paper ready or your journal or whatever you want to use to take notes. We are going to discuss how to astrologically time your rituals. Now, on one hand, this can be extrapolated out to events too. One thing I learned many decades ago is knowing when to act is as important as knowing how to act. And what that stresses is the importance of timing. Timing your work with what's going on in astrology is something that is so flippin' valuable. My business was started using astrological timing. Many weddings that I've done over the years were astrologically timed. And there's example of this after example that I could share with you. And I know many other astrologers fall into the same category, but I point this out because it shows the versatility of what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to focus on rituals and how to astrologically time them, but understand that if you know the principles, you can apply this to any kind of event that you've got going on in your life. So, of course, the first question is, where to start? I mean, not all rituals are the same unless you're using a scripted template or a formula. So when you're first starting, what's the point? What's the starting point? And the first thing to do is determine the element that is associated with your ritual. If you are doing something that is an initiatic process, then it would be the element of water. If you were going to focus on physical manifestation, it would be the element of earth. If you were going to work with something more cerebral, then it'd be the element of air, of course. And then finally, active rituals, whether they are ecstatic movement and trance, or whether they are starting new, say, workout habits or workout routines, those are the element of fire. So when you decide which element that you are going to align with, now really think it through. Here's what I mean by that. You may want to do a ritual for a particular end now, but when you put it just against the lens of this one point, you may look at the ephemeris and say, those conditions aren't right for 6 months. What am I supposed to do? We're talking rituals here. So if the alignment's not there for 6 months, you wait. It's really that simple. If you are timing an event, that's another story, because then you could get into different ways that you could still make it a success, even though the conditions are not optimal. Rituals are something of a personal nature. They're something of a subjective nature. And regardless of what you're doing the ritual for, it means that by and large, you have exhausted or you have put into motion this same concept on the physical plane. So what that means is that when you are astrologically timing a ritual, a lot of things are optional. A lot of things are in line with choosing the best conditions rather than being under the gun to make something happen. So let's use an example. The first one that comes to mind is if you were going to do a ritual of a spiritual initiation of some kind. Now, that could either be fire or water. Generally, initiations are considered water. So the first thing you would look at is when the sun is going through a water sign. It's not now, so you wouldn't be doing those rituals now. You'd want to wait until the sun moves into Scorpio. And really, of the 3 water signs, Scorpio is the one that's the most appropriate, but that's neither here nor there. But now we're going to go down a slight rabbit hole here. put it in context of your chart. I realize not everybody that's listening to this has their astrological chart or has an understanding and a background in astrology, but that is pretty important to achieve success here. So, for example, if you were going to do a ritual for spiritual initiation, then you would want to align it with your 8th or 9th houses. The 8th house, of course, is the house of occultism, and the 9th house is the expansion of consciousness and the house of spirituality. So you would want to see what signs are on those cusps. And yes, I do realize that if you look at the cusps of those houses and they're not water signs, that's okay. Go with what your chart says. But if you're looking at a generic approach or a generic planning, stick with water signs. It gets a little tricky here. Those of you that know astrology know what I'm talking about. But for those of you that don't know astrology, stick with the basic correspondences of the elements. Now, the element itself determines the methodology. And I touched on this, but let's come back and go into a little bit more depth about it. Earth is physical manifestation. Water are initiations as well as emotional situations. Something that has always made me laugh is when somebody says, I'm getting all kinds of manifestations. I had this idea yesterday, and then I get a sign. I get a synchronicity today. What a manifestation. No, that's not a manifestation. Something physical is a manifestation. Having a synchronicity or a synchronous experience like that is not a manifestation. The word manifest means to bring down a physical form. The only way you get a true physical manifestation is if it's actually physical. You can't say, I got a manifestation on this because it didn't fucking manifest. Sorry to use logic here, but critical thinking is kind of absent in the world today. I point this out because if you are focused and interested on physical manifestations, then you're looking at earth signs, specifically without debate. But let's say you want to do some emotional healing and you want this ritual to be a healing ritual. Well, then you would look at water, because the way it would manifest would be down into physical form ultimately. But it can't get down into physical form until you come to terms with whatever you need to come to terms with internally. And that's not physical. It ends up being physical, but at this stage, it's not really. Now, fire signs, of course, are energy and active issues. See, fire is a little tricky in astrology, and not enough places or people talk about this. There's two ways fire manifests in astrology. The first the first fire example is spiritual fire. For those of you that are familiar with Catholicism, you could see it as the Sacred Heart, the Holy Flame, the Holy Spirit, as some sects call it. But then there's the other kind of fire, and this is the one that doesn't get talked about a lot, the physical fire. And I don't mean striking a bic and lighting a fire. I mean you getting active, starting a new workout routine, maybe going for a walk every day, maybe doing something more strenuous like sit-ups and push-ups. So there's physical fire and there's spiritual fire. If you're planning a ritual, you have to really differentiate which one you want to do. The spiritual fire ritual would be one where you realize you're not as connected to divinity as you want to be. And when that happens, you could do a fire ritual to make that occur. But then by that same token, if you're looking around after these COVID years and you see that it's time to start a new workout routine, well, that would still be fire too. Some people could make the case that that's earth as well. And it depends on your perspective, because yeah, it could be considered earth because you're working with the physical body. But there's different kinds of workouts. If you were looking at building muscle mass, that would be more of an earth ritual. Whereas if you were looking at BMI or you were looking at dumping toxins, that would be more of a fire ritual. So really think it through with that aspect of fire. But the takeaway here is that fire can manifest in two different ways. And then finally, air. Air rituals are what most people do, whether or not they realize it. Air rituals are those where you are wanting inspiration. Air rituals are those where you are wanting new ways of looking at things, or maybe you do an air ritual before you start learning a new subject. Or maybe you do an air ritual because you've got something important coming up and you need to make the right networking moves. Now, magically, air also corresponds to invocations. You could argue it has to do with evocations, but that could also fall under the category of fire too. So if you wanted to improve your invocation skill, or if you wanted to connect with a deity and you wanted to do it through invocations, then it would be an air ritual. I realized that even though this course is about timing rituals, I'm talking about a lot of things that are not magically specific. That's intentional. And the reason for that is there's no part of your life that is not magical. This is an idea that the ancient Egyptians had, and the idea has really been corrupted, polluted, and downgraded over the last few thousand years, that there is a difference between magic and day-to-day life. No, there's not. Magic is life and life is magic. There's no separation between the two. If you claim to be a spiritual person when you're in that ritual circle, then when you're not in that ritual circle leading your daily life, you'd better still have the idea that you are a magical person. You don't turn it off and on like a switch. You can, and then your results are going to suffer for it, and your life is going to suffer for it. So through the rest of this course, you're going to see that I am using mundane and magical correspondences interchangeably, and that's the reason why. I'm trying to get us over this toxic polarity thinking and this division that has produced weakness. Now, the energy of the signs also correspond to the houses. This is something that is particularly noteworthy if you have your chart and you're already familiar with astrology. If you don't have your chart and you're not that deeply astrologically read, feel free to skip this. But if you have your chart, we're going to be talking about some nuances in astrology. For example, in the natural zodiac, the first house is a fire house. It's ruled by Aries and Mars. That means if you have a fire sign on that cusp, it manifests more dynamically and more actively than if you have, say, an earth sign there. Fire, earth, opposite elements, that's why. So remember the elemental compatibilities of the houses when you're astrologically timing your ritual. Now, you can see why this can be ignored if you don't have your chart, because we're talking about subtleties and nuances here. Really, all this does is take things and take it to another level, but specifically as it has to do with details and finer points. The next point, and this one is more of a tip on how to use your mind more than anything else. The perception of the ritual is key to how it is approached. For example, if you're doing a ritual for career goals, do you do that ritual when you're in a mental state of, oh crap, I got to do this now because I feel something coming, or oh crap, I've been put under the gun and I got to do this now? Do you do it then? Or do you do it when the astrology says to do it? By doing it when the astrology says to do it, you are uniting the micro with the macro, and that's how you achieve ritual success. If you don't connect the micro with the macro, you can still receive success, but that is more an exertion of willpower rather than divine alignment. Yes, it is always better to be proactive than reactive, but I know from personal experience, sometimes it's worth waiting 2 to 3 years or more to do a ritual rather than just doing it because you want to. Desire is a good thing, but if it dictates your actions, if it dictates your approaches to things and you're ruled by desire, that's absolutely 100% toxic too. You got to find that middle ground. So you can see how it pays to be calculating when you are timing rituals astrologically. You look for the best time. As many of you might know, in the history of occultism, there have been traditional teachings where the right circumstances to consecrate a talisman, let's say, only comes about every few years or every few decades. Thank the gods we've evolved away from that. I still think that's a preferred method and a way to go for those of you that are pondering it. But if you don't have a decade to wait, so fucking what? It's the 21st century. That idea is outdated. It's still applicable. It's still good. I still like it. But don't feel like your hands are tied because those criteria are not met. So now we turn our attention to a little bit more meat. So far, we've been talking about principles and theories. Now let's get into the nuts and the bolts. By now, you should have it clear in your mind what element your ritual corresponds to. If you know your astrological chart, then you should know what signs and elements you're going to be working with for planning this astrological ritual. So now let's talk about the planets. To me, this is metaphysics 101. And I realize not a lot of people out there share that view, but it doesn't take away from the veracity of its truth. If you want to work with your ego or your sense of self, you're talking about the sun. If you want to work with your psychic side or your emotions and your intuition, you're talking about the moon. Communication, adaptability is Mercury. Love, creativity, manifested goddess energy, money, those are all traits of Venus. Mars, you got aggression, you've got conflict, you got war. You also have good health through purification. Initiation, starting things, is usually a Martian trait. Then you have Jupiter. Jupiter is the guru planet. Jupiter is the planet of spirituality. It's the planet of prosperity. It's the planet of expansion. It's the planet of living large and in charge. It's also the planet of rulership. Some people say it's also the planet of good fortune. Some people say good luck, but I don't believe in luck. Luck is when preparation meets opportunity. So there's no such thing as good luck. There is good fortune, though. And then finally, we have Saturn, the planet of teaching, foundation, karma, lessons, limitations, structures, old age. pretty much everything that a lot of people don't like. And of course, over the centuries, all that got rolled into the devil because people don't like to grow up. Those all fall under the sway of Saturn. I hit these points now because now that you know the element and the houses and you have a rough idea of how this is going to be, now you can get into the nuts and bolts of figuring out which planets you want to pay attention to. So for example, if I was going to do a ritual that had to do with increasing my psychic skills, I would be looking at a lunar ritual. If I wanted justice brought to a situation, I would be looking at Saturn or Mars, depending on whether I was content to let the justice play out on its own time frame, Saturn, or if I wanted the instant gratification, Mars. Now, obviously, when we're talking rituals here, the rituals are going to contain elements of pretty much all the planets. I understand that. Look at the dominant planets for the rituals. Then, of course, check to see where they are in the sky. Later on in September, we are coming up on a time when there's going to be a lot of planets moving through Libra. That's a time of justice. So for those of you that are looking at doing a ritual for justice, now you have the heads up at the end of September or the early part of October would be a wise time to do it. The second thing you want to look at here are the ruling planets of the signs. So we're coming up with all this Libra energy. Venus is the ruling planet. When Venus is moving through her own sign, it's generally seen as a time when things line up better. Whereas if Mars is going through Libra, not really a good mix. Mars is considered in a weak spot when it's in Libra. So you do want to micromanage this to a certain degree. The good news is the more planets moving through a sign, the more it outweighs those negative placements. So don't feel like your hands are tied here either. I've said that twice now, and that's an important point. Don't feel like your hands are tied. Remember that ultimately it's your mind that makes all of this happen. Figuring out how you want to say things, figuring out how you want to word your rituals. That can be just as helpful as learning a bunch of correspondences from a book. What about the others? What about the other planets? Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, Chiron, Sedna, Make. We're talking rituals here. The only reason to really look at them is if you're doing rituals that have to do with your connection with society, because those are all trans-Saturnine planets. Those all have to do with society. Those all have to do with the role of the person in context of society. Point blank, I never include those in rituals unless it's an ingress. Or last year I did a powerful ritual with the Grand Conjunction, because why not? But generally, you can ignore all that. Now, I realize some people listening to this might disagree with that. That's their prerogative. If you're one of those people, then do your rituals both ways. Do your rituals ignoring those, and then do a ritual including them. I found you get better results if you exclude them, but that's just me. So then the second thing to look at, now that we've looked at the planets, are the aspects. You see, the aspects create doorways. I'm going to focus on the 5 Ptolemaic aspects, but you can apply this to any secondary aspects that are out there that you want to use. I've just found these, much like the 7 classical planets, to be the ones that can be relied on the most. So a conjunction is when the doorway is wide open. You want to start a new writing project? Do it when there's a Sun-Mercury conjunction. You need to lay down verbal boundaries with someone? Do it when there's a Mars-Mercury conjunction. You want to get through to someone, but they're particularly emotionally fragile? Look at a Mercury-Venus conjunction. Now, sextiles mean the doorway or the portal is open and can easily be accessed. Sextiles manifest a lot like talents. So when there's a lot of sextiles in the air, it means things manifest easier. Now we move on to trines. Trines are very interesting because trines are dormant. Trines are probably the most overhyped aspect in astrology. Everybody wants a trine until they learn about trines. Trines say, if you put in the long-term work, you're going to achieve the success. Trines do not mean if you have trines in your chart, you're automatically going to be good at anything. That would be sextiles. Trines are also known as a lazy person's aspect. If you think back to people you know that they were told they were gifted when they were younger, and because of that, they never developed their full potential, one way to analyze that astrologically is to see that they had the trines and people were pointing it out just using non-astrological words. And because of that, they did a lot of patting on the back, but they never did the work. So the trines stayed dormant. I point this out because if you're planning a ritual and you're thinking about coinciding it when there's trine aspects present, you're looking at an extended working. What do I mean by extended working? You're looking at a ritual where you will have to put in the daily work for 3, 4, 6 months, a year before you get any worthwhile results. So you can see why sextiles are better. But it depends on your time frame. It depends on who you are. It depends on the nature of the subject that you're working with. Oppositions can be tense. That's something to keep in mind. If an opposition is present, then the doorway could be considered locked. So there is a certain amount of tension there. Opposition means that they're not getting along with each other. So that's something to think about too. If you wanted to do a ritual for spiritual initiation, don't do it when you have an opposition between Mercury and Saturn. You're making it harder on yourself. And then finally, we have squares. Squares get a bad reputation. I personally have zero problems with squares. I got a lot of them in my chart. I've learned how to deal with it, and it still makes me laugh whenever I meet people that don't like squares, because it means they don't have a lot in their chart, and therefore they don't have an understanding of how they work. Squares mean that the doorways are hard to walk through. They're hard to spot. Squares mean that you're going to have challenges. On one hand, this is good. Nothing worth having is ever easy. If you want something that's lasting value, get ready to put in the work. On the other hand, squares are very alchemical because it's the agitation process, and you don't get anywhere without any agitation. So keep that in mind too. Now, besides just looking at the aspects present in the transiting sky, also look at the aspects between the transiting sky and your natal chart if you have your natal chart to work with. If you don't have your natal chart to work with, don't worry about it. Now, something to keep in mind here too is the order of the signs. The order, we all know it. If you don't, you're learning it now. Cardinal, fixed, mutable. Angular, succeeding, common. If the planets that you're looking at are coming across your angles in your chart, you're going to get dynamic results for your rituals. If the planets are moving through succeedent houses, the results are not going to be dynamic, but you'll still get results. They'll just be consistent. Now, that is more of a detail perspective. Is it important? I'll let you be the judge. I generally don't worry about it, but I know other people that will take it into account. So now you've got your planets. Now you've got your houses. Now you've got everything lined up for your ritual. You should be having a good idea by now of when you're going to do your ritual. And we haven't even talked about the signs. The reason that I have barely touched the signs is because to me, those are the easiest things to work with. Right now, things are in Virgo. That means rituals having to do with natural magic, having to do with health, having to do with the government, having to do with being of service to humanity. Those are all things that will manifest well during this time. But when we move into Libra, in the latter half of this month, you're going to see that it is more of a time for person-to-person relationships. It's going to be more of a time for justice, for being surrounded by nice things, for diplomacy. That's why I'm spending so little time on the signs. They're the easiest to understand. Those patterns of energy that the signs represent and the mythological underpinnings of them are pretty much 101. If you're looking at planning a ritual, you already know those backstories. And if you don't, then you shouldn't be doing a ritual yet. Learn the stories of the signs. Learn their traits, learn their characteristics, because that'll also tell you how it manifests. I just gave you the traits for Virgo. Now, think about the sign itself. It's mutable earth. So the results you get from a ritual done now are going to be more flowing. They're going to be more in line with manifesting when they're supposed to manifest. The results of that ritual are going to manifest in a grounded, down-to-earth, and practical way. It's not going to be some cerebral epiphany that you have. You're going to see physical results. And if you want to, you can even micromanage this down to picking the particular planetary hour of any given day. So for example, if you were going to do a money ritual, you could do it on a Thursday, which is a day ruled by Jupiter, which has to do with prosperity. You would be doing it on a waxing moon when the energy is all about increase. And you would do it in the day hour of Jupiter. See how all those things line up right there? You can take it that far when you're planning your rituals. You don't have to, but you can. That little formula that I just gave you right there, that's your key. Because you can pretty much swap anything that I said there out for what you want to put in its place. And you get a recipe here. Remember, waning moons are for decrease, cleansings, and new beginnings. Waxing moons are for increase. So you got decrease or increase. You want to start a new project? New moon. You want to take a project you've got and make sure that it manifests as big and as bright as it could be. Full moon. One word of caution is that it's wise to do your best to ignore eclipses. And here's what I mean by ignore. Don't ignore them. Look to see if they're present, but work around them. Don't try and include them in your work because eclipses tend to distort energy. The general rule of thumb is if you don't want eclipses to distort the results of your workings, avoid doing any workings 5 days before the eclipse up to 5 days afterwards. Or if you're coming up on a pair of eclipses as a cycle, 5 days before the first one and 5 days after the second. Can you play with eclipses for ritual ends? You can. Do I encourage it if this is a new technique for you? No. It's something that an advanced magical practitioner can play with. And even then, I'd be very, very careful. But definitely, if you're not used to astrologically timing your rituals, it'd be wise to just kind of ignore the eclipses and just avoid them until you find your rhythm. Then you can play with them. Now, the typical rule of thumb for spell work is that depending on the ritual, it takes about 28 days to manifest. So basically a lunar month. There are exceptions to this, of course. The bigger the project, the bigger the goal, the longer it's going to take to manifest. But that's your rule of thumb. The reason this is important is because it gives you a time frame for quantifiable results. We need that structure, and this is something that a lot of people don't take into account with their spell work. You can say, hey, I want to do a ritual for prosperity. If you don't give it the structure, you might be waiting for those results for 10 to 15 years, and then when it happens, you're like, that's the results of that ritual I did all those years ago. No, it's not. Sorry, you're wrong. That's just the inevitability of the law of averages and probabilities. Because that boat sailed a month or two after you did that ritual all those years ago. When you're doing rituals and they're astrologically timed, it's going to manifest a lot faster, which means in some cases you look at it, you're like, oh yeah, that ritual was 6 weeks ago. I didn't get any results. Well, then you go back to the drawing board and you find out why. You don't sit there and wait and hold out hope for something that's not going to come. So take a moment, process all of this, and think about the ritual that you have in mind. What planets does it correspond to? Is it waxing or waning moon? Is it a small enough ritual that it can manifest in a month? Or are we talking an extended program here? What signs does it correspond to? Now, earlier I talked about the necessity of knowing the signs because you might find that a ritual you want to do is not really conducive with the solar transits. So you look at the situation and immediately it looks like you're going to have to wait a few months before you can do the ritual. There is a workaround for that. And that workaround is you shift your attention to the moon. So if you wanted to do a spiritual cleansing ritual, you'd be looking at Pisces. But right now it's September, everything's in the opposite sign. So you could either A, wait until the sun moves through Pisces, or you could B, look at when the moon is moving through Pisces and check your aspects. Maybe that's the life hack. Maybe that's the shortcut to use. Mercury carries the ritual through the planes. Mars provides the energy for the ritual. So it acts as the firecracker or the lighting of the fuse. And these are two very important points to keep in mind. You also see similar thoughts to this when it comes to planetary stock market trading, but that's a whole conversation for other people and another place. But I pointed out because both Mercury and Mars move fairly quick. So's Venus, and the moon moves even faster. So those would be the planets that you're looking at the most. The moon, Mercury, Venus, and then Mars. So take a few moments, review your notes, and see where you stand with the ritual. All right, got it? Now let's talk about ritual construction to wrap this up. How are you going to construct your ritual? I realize it might seem like it's unrelated to astrology here, but actually it's very related. If you're doing a ritual for, say, spiritual cleansing or spiritual initiation, then you want a ritual that's flowing. You want a ritual that is colorful and creative and stimulating. Whereas if you're doing a ritual for spiritual initiation, you might be looking at Mars. So then you're looking at one that is more fiery and vibrant and alive. So really get into the nuts and bolts when you're planning the ritual. If you're wanting a ritual for prosperity, then part of that prosperity has to do with what you're going to sacrifice to invite the new energy in. A lot of people think prosperity is simply increase, increase, increase. And that's not true at all. You can do that. But as Edward Abbey said, growth for growth's sake is the ideology of a cancer cell. So you can always bring more in, but then you're just becoming toxic. Sometimes prosperity is the increase in your profit margin. So it's not about bringing more in, it's about cutting the overhead. So if you're going to do a ritual for prosperity, what are you going to cut out to make room for the new stuff? If you're not cutting anything out, you may get your results, but it's going to end up working against you in the long run. What kind of ritual are you going to do? How are you going to construct it? If it's going to be more of a Martian ritual, then you're going to want a lot of ecstatic trance and ecstatic movement. If you are looking at something that has to do with healing, then it's going to contain a lot of elements of compassion. If you are looking at doing a ritual that has to do with developing your psychic side, then you have to find the fine line balance between what you're going to do on a daily basis to increase that skill. So what techniques are you going to use? Versus how are you going to free up more time in your life to give to the cultivation of those skills? And that's kind of key. That's kind of important. I know lots of people that want more psychic abilities, but they don't put in the daily work to make it happen. Then you're not going to get it, and you don't deserve to get it. It's a skill. Any musician will tell you, you have to put in the hours of practice to make it happen. If you don't, you're just not going to get the results. That's just the way it is. So if you're looking at doing a ritual for psychic development or psychic skills, good for you. What are you going to cut out of your life to make room for that work? If you have the extra time in your life, good, then you don't have to cut anything out. Now, what part of the day is it going to occupy? And how are you going to be your own taskmaster to make it happen? Astrologically, timing rituals can get very complex, or you can keep it very, very simple. When I was starting off using these techniques, I kept it very simple, just focusing on waxing moon versus waning moon. Now, that was over 20 years ago. I've learned a little bit since then. And now, instead of letting my ego dictate which rituals I'm going to do or what kind of rituals I'm going to do, I let the universe tell me. For example, we're coming up on a Mercury retrograde. If at the beginning of that Mercury retrograde, I have a lot of things come up that tell me that I need to focus in this area of my life, then I'm probably going to do a ritual that has to do with that area of my life. Not something that my reptilian brain, desire mind, lower ego consciousness wants to do, but I'm going to focus with the energies that the universe is saying are present that I should be focusing on anyway. It's a humble perspective. And you get farther with humility in situations like this than you do with toxic ego. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but it's a fact. That's why Mercury retrogrades exist. Those Mercury retrogrades, if they tell us, hey, your attention should be here, then it's not our place to disagree. We should look at it and say, okay, then our attention will be here. May not like it, maybe a pain in the ass, but that's exactly where it needs to be for now. And even though, yes, this does suck in the short term, it's worth it in the long run. Because in the long run, it moves you into a space of anticipation. You start looking at your life as a litmus test. By working with these principles that I'm talking about, you also see your life as a petri dish, and you are the cosmic scientist. So I encourage you to put that to work for you. Thank you all for checking this out. I've got a related course on my website, 418ascendant.com. So if you like this, you can check out that course and many other astrological courses. You can also subscribe to a free newsletter that goes out once a month from there, new blog once a month. I've got daily horoscopes that go out on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, monthly horoscopes on 418ascendant.com or pathwaysstl.com. If you have your own site and you would like to host my monthly horoscopes, definitely drop me an email. I'm all over social media like a rash. My astrology books so far are just Astrology in Theory and Practice and the Teach Yourself Astrology using a year and a day format workbook. But slated for 2022, I'll probably be releasing another astrology book or two. So check those out. Thank you to Stormie Grace for this wonderful opportunity. I'm looking forward to working with you more in the future, my friend. I'm loving this YouTube Academy vibe you got going. So if you're checking this out because you know me, but you don't know her and what she's got going on, check that out too, because it's awesome. Anyway, have a good day. I look forward to chatting with you soon, and blessings of success as you take your rituals to the next level.